hearing. Mr. McInnes, you testify that everything Iran does, its soft power, hard power, projections, they're all interconnected and related to its revolutionary nature. Iran's foreign policy is related to its external and internal politics and is related to its diplomatic, economic, and security activity. And you say that its threat of terror, proxy warfare, and its nuclear weapons program all serve as enablers of its objective, which is all of them counter to U.S. goals. So my first question for all of our witnesses is this: how can we continue to negotiate with an Iranian regime over its nuclear program while setting aside the fact that it is the world's foremost state sponsor of terror, even though Iran continues to engage in these terrorist activities, by ignoring all other aspects of the Iranian regime's nefarious and illicit activities while continuing to negotiate over the nuclear program? How difficult has it made it for the United States and other responsible nations, our allies, to counter any of Iran's terrorist activities? And we've heard from all of you that the tempo of Iran's support for terrorism has seen a resurgence over the last few years, whether it be through its proxies like Hezbollah or directly through IRGC or Quds Force. Iran is seeking to expand its terrorist network globally. What has the United States been doing to counter Iran's expansion and growing influence, especially in the U.S. and Western Hemisphere? And what more can we do or should we be doing? And Chairman Hoekstra, you testified that the Iranian regime is seeking to expand its terrorist activities to incorporate cyber attacks. We've become more and more concerned about the threat of cyber attacks, not only because of how harmful they can be and their ability to impact millions of people, but because of how vulnerable our national infrastructure are to these cyber attacks. And just last week, General Keith Alexander, commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, testified to the Senate Armed Service Committee that the U.S. does not yet have a line drawn in the sand that would prompt a U.S. response for a cyber attack, and that our ability to stop terrorist attacks is actually going down. So just how far advanced and sophisticated do you believe Iran's cyber warfare program to be? What would a cyber attack from Iran look like, and what are the consequences of failing to address this threat? We will begin with Mr. McInnes from the first questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Regarding on the issues of negotiating with Iran on the nuclear program in the context of what it's still supporting for terrorism, I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to understand is what's driving Iran to the table over the last few months. And even though I think I'm highly suspicious of Iran's intentions and its fidelity in its negotiations, as is certainly shared by the rest of the committee here, in the end, Iran is looking for a way out on certain issues right now. And I think Iran is in a position, especially when it comes to its economic as well as what it may be facing in the region, and the war in Syria is the best example of this, that it has a lot of problems right now, and it needs to find a way to get out of the pressure from the sanctions and from the U.S. So I am certainly not opposed to pushing Iran to get to a point where we can where we can verify that it is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. I don't have a lot of confidence in how that we're going to be able to get there, but I don't think necessarily that it would be two separate things. I think what we would need to be doing is a full spectrum approach, pushing against the nuclear program, pushing against terrorism, pushing against Iran's soft power efforts to spread its cultural, religious, and economic influence around the region. That's something that all needs to be done part and parcel. I can't see how you would separate them, though I obviously recognize that from a diplomatic standpoint, it is challenging to do both tracks at the same time, but I think we need to find a way to do that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Levitt?
You hit the nail on the head. This is the $60 million question, and I think the bottom line is this. The nuclear threat is the most severe threat. It's by no means the only one. I think if we try and put everything on the table at once, we're guaranteeing failure. As we've all said, the likelihood of failure is still very, very high. But I'm not so concerned about whether or not we're insisting that this is being negotiated publicly at the table. First of all, we know that some things beyond the nuclear program, missiles in particular, have been brought up. Iranian officials and others have said this publicly. But the fact that we now talk in government about the Iran Threat Network, the ITN, when something gets an acronym in government, you know you've gotten somewhere. When I was in the Treasury Department and they started talking about FININT, financial intelligence, we knew that as a discipline within the intelligence community, we'd gotten somewhere. There is a lot, actually, that is happening, but it tends to happen quietly. The one thing that happens publicly is exposures. So, for example, I'm very proud that my former department, the Treasury Department, continues to expose Iran's illicit conduct around the world, including things that you might consider to be quite sensitive. So, for example, the fact that al-Qaeda is playing both sides. Iran, that is playing both sides. Obviously, they're defending the Assad regime in huge ways in Syria, and yet Treasury just exposed that they're allowing al-Qaeda to use Iran as a transit point for funding and supporting its network from within Iran, so long as al-Qaeda didn't carry out attacks in Iran to fund who? Jabhat al-Nusra. This is huge, and we've done a lot diplomatically as well. So, for example, when weapons shipments from Iran through Iraq were caught going to Bahrain, it wasn't U.S. officials who were out there saying, hey, this is a problem. It was Europeans, and that's great. The European Union has banned the military and terrorist wings of Hezbollah, not as much as we'd have liked, but it's a good step. The GCC has done things. And in fact, we have had a shadow war with Iran over primarily its nuclear program, which suggests that actually under this administration, some of the covert things have been going on quite nicely. So I don't think it's fair to say nothing's going on, but we do need, and it's why I started my testimony by saying this is so timely, we do need to have public discussions about how important this is and how, it's not a very Western way of thinking, but Iran continues to push this envelope even as it's sitting at the table.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. Chairman Hoekstra.
Thank you, Chairwoman. A couple of things here. I think as I listen to the opening statements of the members, I share their concern that breaking the nuclear program off from all of the other activities that Iran has been engaged in is very, very concerning. Not knowing the parameters, or the public not knowing what the parameters of what those negotiations may or may not include, is also of concern. You may remember back in 2007, you and I co-authored an op-ed piece, and we wanted the Bush administration at that time to release the details of the attack against the Syrian nuclear plant. And this was some months after that, because we wanted the American people to know about the potential relationship between Iran and Syria, and that this facility had actually been taken out. The third thing that you asked about was, what are the cyber capabilities of Iran? And coming from the intelligence world, we've always been concerned about how little we actually know about Iran, whether it's its nuclear program or its cyber capabilities. But what we do know at this time, it has launched cyber attacks against the U.S., it's launched them against Saudi Arabia, it's launched them against a number of other entities around the world. Also, as experts have taken a look at their programs, they've said in a very short period of time, and a surprising, and that's always a concern in the intelligence community when you hear a surprise. But what they said 2 or 3 years ago, Iran was a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 capability. And today, they've closed that gap dramatically. So there's two things that we're concerned about. How quickly they did it, and more importantly, who helped them do it? Because we believe that they probably didn't do this on their own. And the most likely candidate for that is the cooperation that they have with Russia. What would a cyber attack look like against the United States? We've seen other people hacking into the systems, whether it's Target or something like that. I don't think that's what we would see. You would see something perhaps that would cause an economic disruption, which would be an attack against some of our financial institutions, our financial markets, or those types of things, or potentially against our infrastructure. The scary thing there is they have the capability to do that. We don't necessarily have the means to defend it, as General Alexander recently said. And the third thing is, if something like that occurred, it would be very, very difficult to pinpoint exactly who the perpetrators would be. It could be Iran, but it might be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to track it back to Iran.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And now we'll turn to my Florida colleague, Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member of our subcommittee.
Thank you.